They thought no one was watching. A convoy moved silently through the dunes of Agadez, cloaked in dust and deception. Among them, a man with no name, or rather, too many names. He said his name was Abubakar Buber Bella, just a driver. Just a passerby. Just another shadow in the Sahel. But he was not. His fingerprints had burned villages. His footsteps had echoed through the ashes of Libya. His real name was Barhadine Mehdoune. A former Libyan officer. A ghost from a broken regime. A fugitive of a war no one wants to admit still rages. And Niger caught him. But the real question is not how. It is why, and who sent him. Because what lies beneath this arrest is a story the world has tried to bury beneath headlines and silence. If you believe this story must be heard, like, comment, and subscribe. This is no ordinary capture. It may be the first strike in a hidden war. When questioned by the Nigerian security forces, he did not stutter. "My name is Abubakar Buber Bella," he said. A driver by trade. A man with no past. But the soldiers had seen his face before, in intelligence reports, in dossiers. In the aftermath of massacres. He had changed names. But not his path. Captured in the Agadez region while leading armed fighters through the desert, Barhadine Mehdoune, once a Libyan army officer, now stood exposed. Unmasked. The desert, however, does not forget. And Niger does not forgive. He was not born in Niger. He was bred in the ashes of a foreign fire. Barhadine Mehdoune did not come from the sand, he came from the ruins. Once a soldier in Libya's fractured army, he walked away from his flag the day NATO dropped democracy from the sky. In 2011, the West declared war on a nation it didn't open, not surgically, but savagely. The state collapsed. Borders bled. And out of the chaos rose warlords, scavengers. And men like Mehdoune. He was not the worst. But he was efficient. He trained under commanders who once wore Western uniforms. He studied maps marked by foreign intelligence. He memorized targets, villages in Mali, convoys in Niger, and recruitment centers hidden in the Sahel's silence. By the time the world turned its gaze away from Libya, Mehdoune had already crossed into the Sahel. But he did not come alone. He brought arms. He brought ideology. He brought instructions. And above all, he brought money. Libya was not a mistake. It was a mechanism. Ask any honest analyst and they will tell you, after Libya fell, the floodgates opened. Weapons once secured by the state flowed into black markets. Fighters once loyal to Gaddafi splintered into factions. And behind many of those factions, you will find the fingerprints of Western consultants, faceless men who never wear uniforms, yet always leave scars. Mehdoune operated with shocking precision. Too much, some say, for a rogue militia leader. His timing, his movement, even his evasion tactics, they resemble trained special forces, said one officer in Niger, speaking off record. It's as if someone coached him for this desert war. Indeed, many believe Mehdoune was no ordinary fighter. He was a vector, a carrier of something deeper, more designed. Why Niger? Why now? Because the Sahel, once a forgotten frontier, has become the battlefield of global reordering. The AES alliance, forged by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, represents not just a military union, but an ideological threat to the old order. An Africa that chooses sovereignty over subservience, cooperation over colonization, unity over dependency. To those clinging to the old world's grip on Africa, that is dangerous. The Sahel must be destabilized. The new alliance must be distracted. The people must be discouraged. And so, men like Mehdoune arrive. Not randomly. Not independently. But, perhaps, as part of a larger strategy. If you believe Mehdoune crossed the desert alone, you have not been paying attention. That's what Captain Ibrahim Traoré warned last year, in a speech the West tried to ignore. He spoke of terrorism as a fire lit in Libya, not by religion, not by poverty, but by geopolitical greed. And what a fire it has become. The people of Niger know this fire. They have seen villages disappear under it. They have seen markets bombed, roads ambushed, and children recruited before they could read. But now, for the first time in years, the fire is being answered. Not by begging the West for air support. Not by hosting foreign bases. But by building their own defense. The capture of Barhadine Mehdoune was not luck. It was the result of intelligence-led tracking, cross-border cooperation within AES, and a refusal to be passive observers in their own tragedy. It was, in many ways, a declaration. "We are not your buffer zone," said General Abdourahmane Tiani, the president of Niger, in a recent briefing. "We are not here to absorb your chaos. We will not host your wars. And we will not raise your monsters anymore." The arrest of Mehdoune is not the end of a threat. It is the beginning of an awakening. Because to confront a system like this, you must name it. And Mehdoune's name is just the start. If you believe Africa has the right to defend its future, drop your voice in the comments. Tell the world, we are not fooled. This is not just about one man with a false name. It is about the truth we are no longer afraid to speak. What the world calls silence is often a battlefield with the sound turned off. After the arrest of Barhadine Mehdoune, global headlines moved on. A few agencies reported the incident with diplomatic restraint. A handful of foreign ministries issued vague statements about regional security. But in Niger, something deeper stirred. Something that could not be written in press releases. It was not just the men they had caught. It was the system he belonged to. Behind every warlord lies a web of supply chains. Funding routes, safe houses, and silence, a machinery of terror that moves quietly, without flags, without uniforms. And in the Sahel, that machinery has long been misread, misnamed, or ignored. Until now. Niger's armed forces had not stumbled into Mehdoune by chance. His arrest was not luck. It was the result of weeks of quiet surveillance, of nights without sleep. Of soldiers disguised as villagers, intelligence officers posing as traitors, and commanders using maps not drawn in Western capitals but drawn from memory, from wounds, from the whispers of those who still believed the land could be reclaimed. What unfolded in Agadez was not an operation. It was a revelation. Mehdoune had made one mistake. He believed he was still invisible. But something had shifted in the Sahel. Since the rise of the AES alliance, since Traoré, Goïta, and Tiani tore up the old scripts written by embassies and advisors, a new doctrine had taken shape: security without subservience, intelligence without dependence. And most importantly, memory without amnesia. These new leaders understood what was never written in any NATO briefing, that terrorism in the Sahel had never been just ideology. It had been a tool, used to destabilize, to justify military presence, to keep Africa looking outward for solutions. But Niger, under Tiani, began looking inward. It started to listen not to satellite data from Paris, but to shepherds who noticed unfamiliar footprints near their wells. To merchants who remembered what Mehdoune looked like before he changed names. To mothers who whispered the names of missing sons in exchange for a chance to be heard. The intelligence that brought down Mehdoune did not come from drones. It came from the ground. In the weeks leading to his capture, a quiet map was built, a human map. A woman in Timia who sold satellite phone chargers noticed a man asking questions about military convoys. A teenage boy in Arlit saw someone bury a crate under the sand and marked the spot with stones. A retired colonel, long dismissed by international advisors as too nationalistic, connected the dots with a pencil and a page. Piece by piece, the shadow was made visible. And then came the turning point. A decrypted message, intercepted on a makeshift frequency: the driver crosses on the new moon. No flags. No comms. Contact only if intercepted. That driver was Mehdoune. His alias, Bouberbella. The operation that followed was not flashy. It was not filmed for foreign donors. It was swift, local, precise. And it ended with a man, once invisible, now shackled by truth. But the real capture was not just of Mehdoune. It was the exposure of the network that shielded him. The fake NGOs that moved medical supplies across unsecured borders. The so-called journalists who arrived before every major attack, but never published stories. The sudden infrastructure projects funded by overseas groups that seemed to follow the same route as the arms convoys. In the interrogation room, Mehdoune said little. But his silence said enough. His sat phone held numbers linked to logistics coordinators in Tripoli, to arms brokers in Ojdabia, and to a certain private firm with a London address that no longer existed, except on paper. Niger's military intelligence did not wait for approval from foreign embassies. They followed the trail. And what they found was staggering. Not just networks, but methods. Not just names, but intentions. There were files marked with village names weeks before those villages were attacked. There were instructions on when to escalate violence in proximity to international conferences. There were payments, large ones, made in cryptocurrency, in anticipation of media silence. It was not just terror. It was orchestration. And perhaps the most damning discovery was this: in a memo dated 8 months prior, a Western risk advisory group had warned its contractors to avoid Agadez due to expected instability. That was before any attacks had occurred. Someone had known. Someone had predicted the chaos, not to prevent it, but to time it. And in that moment, Niger understood the war it was truly fighting. Not just against Mehdoune. Not just against jihadists. But against an architecture of shadow, carefully built, meticulously denied, profitably maintained. So the question changed. It was no longer, how do we stop these men? It became, how many are still hiding behind institutions? Because when Mehdoune was unmasked, the mask tore at more than one face. In military circles within AES, a phrase began to spread: we do not just defend borders. We defend memory. It was not about nostalgia. It was about reclaiming the right to define danger. To choose who is a threat, to refuse the language of dependency. The West had long demanded African loyalty in exchange for information. But now, information flowed in a different direction. From Niger's deserts. From Mali's forests. From Burkina's villages. They were building their own intelligence. No consultants. No observers. No intermediaries. Just men and women who had lived the war, bled from it, buried their children because of it, and who now decided to see with their own eyes. This was the real threat to those who profited from darkness, not guns. But clarity. Not warlords, but warriors with purpose. And as the world looked elsewhere, a quiet revolution of knowing had begun. No announcements. No declarations. Just the rustling of sand. And the snapping of old chains, link by link. There comes a moment when a nation no longer asks for permission to defend itself. For years, the Sahel was spoken of as fragile. Unstable, in need of foreign support. It is dug not for war, but for survival. It became more than a slogan. It became a principle. In the interrogation room, Mehdoune offered the usual excuses: he was forced, he was misled, he never ordered the killings. He said he had information, that he could help, that perhaps there was still a place for him. But the officers in the room did not flinch. They had heard it all before. They had buried enough children to know what mercy had cost them. Across the Sahel, in the wake of his arrest, stories began to surface. Survivors of villages once too afraid to speak began naming names. Fighters who had defected under amnesty now returned with renewed conviction. They had seen Mehdoune not as a man, but as a symbol of everything that had gone unchecked. Unnamed, unresolved. He represented the margin of tolerance that had been exploited too long. But that margin was gone. Niger's leadership, bolstered by the alliance of AES, began drafting new internal policies. Foreign NGOs operating near sensitive areas would be reviewed. Any entity found facilitating, knowingly or not, the movement of arms or fighters would be blacklisted. Even diplomatic vehicles would be subject to random inspection. Some called it extreme. But they had not seen the videos recovered from Mehdoune's devices. They had not seen the planned attack routes. They had not heard the laughing voices of men discussing the timing of a massacre around a political summit. To maximize international attention, the Sahel was done playing the part of the helpless victim. This was not revenge. It was clarity. And clarity comes with consequences. For the first time, Niger's justice system proposed that captured foreign fighters no longer be automatically transferred to international courts. Instead, they would be tried on African soil, under African law. Judged not by distant lawyers but by the very communities they had attacked. That decision ignited debate. International observers warned about due process, about standards of human rights. But few of them had walked through the ruins of Agando or slept in the silence of a burned school. The AES alliance stood firm. Traoré voiced it in Ouagadougou. Goïta confirmed it in Bamako. Tiani made it policy in Niamey. No more second chances. For too long, leniency had been weaponized. Ceasefires had been used to regroup. Dialogues had become detours. Funding had become fuel. It was time for a different approach. The military campaigns that followed Mehdoune's arrest were not simply mop-ups. They were coordinated efforts to dismantle his entire operational echo. Dozens of camps were uncovered, some hidden in plain sight. Arms caches buried under cemeteries. Fake orphanages used for recruitment. But perhaps the most significant strike was not physical. It was narrative. For years, the story of the Sahel had been written by others. Reports framed in London, policies drawn in Washington, recommendations sent from Geneva. Africa had spoken. But only through interpreters. Now, the continent began to speak in its own voice, direct, unapologetic, precise. The message was clear: we will not outsource our pain any longer. In a rare public address, President Tiani stood before the national flag and said, "This is not just about one man. It is about the chain he was part of. And we are breaking every link." The speech went viral across Francophone Africa. In Mali, school children learned his name. In Burkina Faso, families lit candles not for mourning, but for marking a turning point. In Niger, crowds began to chant, "Agadez was not the end. It was the beginning." This was not just national pride. It was geopolitical realignment. The AES alliance, once dismissed as a short-term bloc of military regimes, now emerged as a regional force with vision, coherence, and intent. Their military cooperation extended beyond borders. Intelligence was shared, not sold. Operations were launched in concert, not competition. And in every communiqué, one phrase remained: no more second chances. It was not just a line. It was a firewall, against betrayal, against manipulation, against the slow poison of appeasement. The message resonated far beyond the Sahel. In coastal states still struggling with foreign interference, young officers began citing AES doctrine. In diaspora communities once skeptical of military leadership, new trust began to form. And in Western capitals, concern turned to confusion. Why had the narrative shifted? How had these nations, once reliant on aid and advisors, begun setting their own terms? The answer lay not in ideology, but in lived experience. The Sahel had known what it meant to believe in promises made by those who had never walked their streets. It had seen what happened when security was outsourced. When strategy was dictated, when sovereignty was a word written in reports but absent from reality. Now, that word had returned. Not as rhetoric. As practice. No more second chances. Because the first chance had been wasted on negotiation. The second had been lost in trust. There would not be a third. Mehdoune's story ended not with a trial, but with a truth. A nation had drawn the line. And for the first time, that line was not in the sand. It was in stone. Barhadine Mehdoune was not smart enough to design the war. He was brutal, yes. Cunning, perhaps. But strategic. Visionary. Capable of orchestrating a decade-long corridor of chaos through Libya, Niger, and Mali. Unlikely. When Niger's investigators traced the satellite phone found in his bag, the signal bounced through 3 countries before hitting a server registered in Germany. The company behind it no longer existed, at least not on paper. It had been dissolved. Renamed, restructured, sold. A familiar pattern to anyone who had ever chased shell companies in war zones. Then came the documents. Encrypted folders. Names of villages marked for disruption. Coordinated attacks scheduled weeks in advance. Target dates that eerily aligned with key international summits on African security and investment. Someone had been managing perception. Someone had known when to strike, not for military advantage, but for narrative effect. The deeper Niger's intelligence dug, the clearer the pattern became. Mehdoune's logistics chain did not begin in the Sahel. It began in bank accounts in Dubai, in meetings in Istanbul, in corporate backdoors in Geneva and Marseille. His paymasters never touched the sand. They wore cufflinks, not keffiyehs. And then the twist tightened. In one of the decoded files was a risk assessment dated 6 months before the Agadez operation. It included a chilling line: in the event of asset compromise, maintain plausible deniability. Frame as local insurgency. Who wrote that file? Not Mehdoune. Not any of his fighters. It was drafted by a private security consultancy headquartered in London, one with historical contracts linked to post-Gaddafi operations in Libya, as well as training programs in counterterrorism risk zones. And suddenly, the pieces aligned. Mehdoune had not escaped justice for years because he was invisible. He had escaped because he was useful. To whom? To those who needed chaos to justify presence. To those who needed fear to control policy. To those who needed a broken Sahel to keep its minerals flowing out and its people looking up instead of forward. The truth was stark: the most dangerous warlords in Africa did not carry AK-47s. They carried laptops. They sat in conference panels about peace and stability. They wrote reports about the very violence they financed, calling it complex tribal dynamics. And all the while, they measured success not in lives saved, but in stability delayed. Barhadine Mehdoune was a terrorist. But he was also a subcontractor. A disposable piece in a game whose board was drawn in the post-colonial playbook and updated for the 21st century. That is why his arrest was not celebrated in certain capitals. Because it did not just reveal a man. It revealed a business model. And Niger, in capturing him, had pulled the thread that might just unravel it all. To those still hiding behind briefcases and boardrooms, to those who orchestrate darkness from safe distances, hear this. We are not looking up to ask for help anymore. We are looking straight ahead, and we see you now. Barhadine Mehdoune's face was unmasked. But more importantly, so was the system that fed him, protected him, and used him. And we will not forget. Not the children lost. Not the towns erased. Not the silence imposed on our sovereignty. Africa is not your laboratory. The Sahel is not your testing ground. Niger is not your pawn. If you still believe we will wait for justice to be delivered from outside, you are too late. We are delivering it ourselves. If the courage of those who stood in Agadez touched something in you, do not stay silent. Like, comment, subscribe, and carry this message forward. Because sovereignty is not given. It is built. And it is defended. Now and always.